game opens uniquely with an old Indian defense as Nezhmetdinov plays for an early pawn to e5. About this move he comments, Black usually chooses such a move order so as to avoid the difficult Simish system. That's an interesting comment because to date, the Simish system in which White is playing for f3 and e4 is not considered the most dangerous against the King's Indian defense. However, this is the 1950s, the theory is all being established, and at the time, Nezhmetdinov did not want to play that line. Now, from here, we see the move pawn to e4 in this position after e5 from Polugaevsky. About this move, Nezhmetdinov says, in this variation, Black gains rich counter chances. In my view, the more flexible knight to f3, not defining the position in the center for the time being, causes significantly more trouble and hinders the creation of counterplay. Of course, this is very classical advice because now Nezhmetdinov can play and does play the capture on d4, forcing the queen to capture back, and he's able to develop the knight, pushing the queen back in this case. He's gaining time and gaining really, really good control over the dark squares, which is going to be a key part of his strategy going forward. As a result, he already has a good opening position, but it's definitely one where both players can play, and maybe that's all that Polugaevsky wanted. Now we get pawn to g6, b3, bishop g7, bishop b2, castles, bishop d3, knight g4, which is a very interesting move, opening up the bishop and keeping more of an eye on all kinds of dark squares in the center of the board and preparing this queen hop. Next up, knight g to e2. Nezhmetdinov comments that all this was played by White Polugaevsky in quick tempo. The present game shows that also after this move knight to e2, Black has good chances of developing an initiative. Now, Nezhmetdinov strikes out, queen to h4, tickling these dark squares and threatening simply queen takes on f2. Now, at this point, Polugaevsky needs to figure out how to defend f2 while creating the minimum amount of weaknesses in his position, compromising as little as possible. That's difficult because every response is going to involve some concession to Nezhmetdinov. Ultimately, Polugaevsky goes for knight to g3, and this move seems to be a mistake. Better was the move g3. This move will weaken the light squares, but Nezhmetdinov is not trying to attack on the light squares, nor is he really set up to do so. So this move here maintains a much more balanced position, which again is one that allows both players to play for a win. After the move knight g3, the knight is awkwardly placed right here, and Nezhmetdinov is ready to start expanding on the king side. In fact, he can already do that with the move pawn to f5. Now, he didn't want to play f5 in the game because f4 concerned him, but the chess engine says that knight b4 is now a really good strike. And again, White is not castled here. The king is sitting on e1. There are all kinds of threats to be concerned about here, like knight takes on h2, knight takes d3, general pressure here on e4, and the computer already indicates that Black is winning, and I think there's really no reason to challenge this. Nezhmetdinov played amazingly in this game, but immediately pushing forward with f5 was stronger than the move played in the game, which is knight g to e5. So, after knight g e5, we see Polugaevsky castle here, and now we do get the expansion pawn to f5. There is an interesting sideline here that I'd like to note. It is the move knight g4, which Nezhmetdinov analyzed in depth during the game and after the game. Now, after knight g4, a very tempting continuation is pawn to h3. In fact, this is totally forced because you have to defend h2 and there's no other way to defend it. So this is forced, but then the tempting continuation is knight takes f2. And Nezhmetdinov had seen this. He didn't just miss, oh, I can go for this line. Because in this position, if the rook takes, Black has just won a pawn by taking on g3. If the king takes right here, then you can just play bishop to d4 check, trying to push the king away from the knight, and again you'll win a pawn. The king can step up to f3, but then knight e5 check is just a disaster, and again, you're going to be able to take down here. So what's the problem here? Why wouldn't you go for this very forcing continuation that's winning a pawn? Well, it's queen takes f2, which does walk into bishop d4, pinning and winning the queen, But then what concerned Nezhmetdinov was the queen sacrifice, queen takes d4, knight takes, and then knight up into d5. This is actually very reminiscent of his game against Chernikov. Now, it's not actually reminiscent because that game is not going to happen for a few years yet, but it is very similar in theme. The knight and bishop here create a lot of counterplay. The engine thinks that white can still, or black can still get an advantage, but probably it's very difficult to play the black pieces and deal with all of this pressure on the dark squares. And generally this totally turns the game around, producing a position that is much more one that Nezhmetdinov would like to play with the white pieces. So, after Polugaevsky castles, we do not see this move knight g4, which would win material by force due to the pressure against f2 and h2. Instead, we see pawn to f5, which seems at least practically to be stronger. Now, after pawn f5, we see pawn to f3, and now bishop to h6. So we're tickling the queen over here. At this point, really what Polugaevsky should do according to the engine is play pawn to f4, but this is only something you can prove with deep computer analysis. And in practice, it's actually very, very clever what Polugaevsky does, and Nezhmetdinov has to be very, very imaginative to continue his attack. If in this position Polugaevsky had played pawn to f4, then there's knight g4, hitting this h2 square again, h3, queen takes g3, pawn takes on g4, and now not just like a recapture here, because if you play queen takes g4 in this position, knight d5 is actually creating all kinds of problems over here. Remember that the bishop h6 move pulled the bishop away from the long diagonal. So that's a challenge here. However, you don't have to capture on g4 right away. You can play knight to e5. This pawn on f4 is pinned. You're hitting d3. You're looking to capture on g4 in a more effective way. You're also closing down this long diagonal for a moment. And generally, black has a very strong attack in this position. But after bishop h6, we actually see Polugaevsky pull back with queen d1. Now we see pawn to f4, pushing forward for a pawn storm on the king side, knight back to e2, pawn to g5, knight up to d5, pawn g4, and now this is very, very clever and basically forced from Polugaevsky. He plays pawn g3. At this point, he really has to play this way. There's all kinds of attacking ideas for black, including g3, with mating ideas on h2, and then an easy bishop sack on h3. So this move here is, opening up the king side a little bit, but it's actually hard to get at the white king, and we'll see some ideas from Polugaevsky where the king could actually run into the middle of the board, and he could be better. We get pawn takes g3, pawn takes g3, queen h3, and now f4. At this point, Nezhmetdinov comments, now, black only has to make two natural attacking moves, knight f3 check, king up, and queen h2 check, and the picture changes abruptly. After king e3, running the king into the middle of the board, the white king is safely covered, while black falls under a scarcely resistible attack. What to do? So this is a critical moment in the game, because the most natural move on the board, knight f3 check, going after the king, actually does completely fail for black. Nezhmetdinov has no attack if the king is able to sit safely here on e3, and suddenly there's all kinds of things for him to worry about, and the computer says that white is totally winning in this position. Pressure on the long diagonal, ideas of going after the h-file with rook h1, ideas of maybe trapping the queen in some cases, just taking on c7 could be an issue, etc., etc. The ideas are numerous and problematic. The right move, the excellent move that Nezhmetdinov plays, is bishop to e6. He develops his last minor piece and does not retreat the knight on e5. If the knight on e5 is captured, the point is that you can take here on d5, and after the recapture, you have one control over the e3 square by eliminating the knight that was defending the square, and this is just checkmate. So bishop e6 is the perfect illustration of how you can continue the attack by, furthering your development, staying focused on your goals when your opponent is trying to push you back. Now, after bishop e6, we get the move bishop to c2, rook up to f7. The computer does not like this move, but if you let it analyze deeply enough, it will eventually understand Nezhmetdinov's idea. The king tries to run, queen h2 check, king up to e3. Now, in this case, it's different than the prior example we looked at. Black is more developed, and black does have winning attacking ideas here. Bishop takes d5, pawn takes d5, knight to b4, putting pressure here on c2. And now, in this position, we should point out that the only move to try and defend objectively is the move a3, tickling that knight and forcing knight takes c2 now, and after queen takes and queen h3, making a pin on the g3 pawn that could allow some bishop takes f4 or rook takes f4 ideas. We actually have a position that is better for black, but it's not obvious how you can actually win this position for black. Still very, very complicated, better for Nezhmetdinov, but this is not yet winning. In the game, the incredibly natural move rook h1 is played, after which there's only one try for Nezhmetdinov in this position. Of course, he has prepared it way back when he played bishop to e6, and it is this move that really makes this game famous. That move is rook takes f4. And about this move, Nezhmetdinov says, a sacrifice that black had intended at his 19th move, which is bishop e6, and which he decided on only now. The interesting variations presented below represent only a small part of the innumerable possibilities. To calculate at the board all of the likely continuations was undoubtedly impossible. This combination is intuitive, and precisely because of this, it was all the more difficult to decide on it. After this utterly amazing sacrifice that offers both the rook and the queen in the same turn, white has three possible captures. However, after investigation, it will turn out that only the capture of the queen is a really viable option. If you try knight takes f4, then you have opened up the second rank that allows knight takes c2 check. Your king has nowhere to run, so you must surrender the queen, but then you are simply losing in the resulting position. Alternatively, you can also try taking with the pawn. Then you see some of the same themes because black has bishop takes f4 check. Once again, knight takes opens the second rank and allows knight takes c2 check, but if you try running with king d4, now we have the option queen f2 check, and that leads to mate after king c3, queen c5, a very beautiful checkmate. As a result, after rook takes f4, white basically must try rook takes h2, accepting the queen sacrifice. Now, we see rook f3 check. This is a double check, and the king only has one safe square to run to. That is king to d4. This is now a critical position. The white king is obviously in huge trouble sitting here on d4, where it has no squares to run to, but it's also not clear how to checkmate this white king. You need to be very careful, as sometimes white is able to give up material and escape. Accuracy is required. Ultimately, Nezhmetdinov plays the move bishop to g7, and here he comments, after this, there arises a problem-like position that perhaps deserves a special diagram. Black is a whole queen down, but on the other hand, white's king is for the time being in a mating net. The peculiarity of the position consists in the fact that black's main threats are expressed with quiet moves. In particular, there is now threatened b5, followed by knight e to c6 and checkmate. If required, there is also the threat of c5 check, pawn takes, followed by c5 checkmate. White defends against the first threat, but cannot repulse the second. The game concluded as follows. It is not an exaggeration to say that in this position there are pages of analysis dedicated to all the ways that white can try, ultimately unsuccessfully, to escape black's clutches. I'm not going to unpack all of that analysis here, but I am going to show you my favorite attempt for white, how it is refuted, and then we'll see the game continuation. Now, is knight g1, trying to go after the rook on f3 that is preventing white's king from escaping back down the board and getting out of the middle of the board. In this position, black does well to pick up an extra pawn, but then after knight e2, you have to go back, and it looks like we might have a perpetual. With an extra pawn in hand now, though, black can continue the attack. Knight e to d3 check, king to c4, and knight takes b2 check. Now, yes, this is a royal fork, which is always nice, but we've sacrificed so much material already that winning the queen is not going to be enough. After king takes b4, we should play for mate. Bishop to c3 check. If the white king runs up the board, there is simply mate with a6 checkmate. And after bishop c3 check, if the king runs back to a3, you should be clever and play the brilliant b5, going for the beautiful b4 checkmate. After b5, the most resourceful attempt for white is queen to d4, trying to pull the bishop away so that this will no longer be checkmate. That bishop does capture, which now allows white to capture the rook here on f3. At this point, you should put the bishop back on c3, threaten checkmate again here, and now after b4, the only move to create some escape squares, you can go knight c4 check with the point that you are picking up the rook here on a1. In this position, black is able to win the endgame comfortably, partially thanks to picking up the pawn on g3. Now, in the actual game, instead of allowing this, after bishop g7, this quiet move that so beautifully seals in the threats to the white king, we see the move pawn to a4. This stops that idea of b5 when any knight discovery is just checkmate. Currently, a knight discovery is not checkmate because it opens up the c4 square, so this idea combats b5 and then knight discovery and mate. But after pawn to a4, we see the more forcing continuation. c5 check, pawn takes, and now pawn takes, threatening c5 and checkmate. To prevent that from being checkmate, we see bishop d3 from Polugaevsky, which allows some retreat along the third rank. Knight takes d3 with a discovered check. King c4, d5 check, pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5. The white king is running up the board, hoping to escape checkmate, but of course, black has plenty of forces to deliver mate in multiple ways. He does find the mate in 3, rook to b8 check, king a5, knight back to c6, and in this position, white resigned without allowing the final checkmate, which would have been king a6, and then knight to b4, or rook b6, or knight c5. Black has many choices. I hope that you've enjoyed this incredibly beautiful game as much as I hope that you were inspired